Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to 30 on Thursdays, SusQtech's bi-weekly webinar series. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's topic, which is SharePoint disaster recovery. What are my options? We'll go ahead and get started with a little bit of housekeeping, as we do every time. If this is your first time on a 30 on Thursday, we've been doing this about 18 months now. It's a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series with anything and everything to do with SharePoint. We cover topics from metadata to design to my sites to disaster recovery to governance to you name it. And, try to kind of vary the topics as much as possible. There's a full schedule of our upcoming webinars on SusQtech.com/webinars. Our next webinar is on October 4th, and it's going to be a follow-up to one we just did on metadata versus folders. We had a lot of interest in a session on enterprise keywords. So we're going to delve deeper into managed metadata and enterprise keywords in SharePoint 2010 in our next session, which is on October 4th. Today's session is being recorded, so if you have to cut out early or weren't able to make the whole thing, it'll be available on our website. And all of our past recordings are available at SusQtech.com/archive-webinars. And if you have a question for Ryan or myself during today's session, please use the question window, typically located on the right-hand side of your screen, as part of GoToWebinar, and we'll leave some time at the end for any and all questions. If you like the online format for learning about SharePoint, SusQtech does offer a number of online classes. Our next class is document management in SharePoint 2010. That's coming up on October 18th. This is a 3-hour paid class, $69 for the 3-hour session. That's coming up on October 18th. We've done a couple of these. They're listed down there at the bottom. We started with responsive design, we did BI, we did some no-code solutions, and then yesterday, Liam Cleary, one of our MVPs, did a developer crash course all about authentication, authorization, and security. And the recordings of those are also available for sale on our website, so be sure to check it out. So to jump into today's topic is SharePoint disaster recovery. What are my options? Our presenter today is Ryan Thompson from Baseline. I'm Steve Witt from SusQtech, and I'll be acting as the moderator. And before I turn it over to Ryan to walk through the session, I wanted to just mention that this is kind of a follow-up to a session that Sean McDonough did back in March of this year, where he kind of gave the high-level overview of disaster recovery as it pertains to SharePoint. This is a little bit of a different take on it. Baseline is a company that provides a full-service solution to disaster recovery, not just SharePoint, but to disaster recovery as a whole. And we all know that as SharePoint has grown in popularity over the last 4 or 5 years, that SharePoint is becoming more and more a mission-critical application for a lot of organizations. So uptime and availability are of the utmost importance, and with that comes the ability to recover from a disaster or get the SharePoint back online if something should happen, if you have an outage, if you have a server failure, etc. So Ryan's going to talk today about what Baseline offers in terms of disaster recovery. They all have a number of clients that run SharePoint and host SharePoint and are using their service to ensure maximum uptime and availability of their SharePoint system. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ryan, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you, Steve. Yeah, I did have a chance to watch Sean's presentation some couple of weeks ago when I was first signed up to do this presentation, and Sean did a fantastic job. I learned quite a bit from it about SharePoint itself and the disaster recovery for it. As Steve mentioned, we're not SharePoint experts. We are a disaster recovery provider, but I've done my best to brush up on my SharePoint knowledge and went and talked to a couple of our customers who do their SharePoint disaster recovery with us and got a little bit of feedback. As I go through today's presentation, Steve, you want to hit the next slide? I will do my best to keep it from being salesy. I know that is the last thing that anybody really wants to hear, so what we're going to do today is fly at a 3,000-foot view and look at SharePoint and how the disaster recovery for it falls into your disaster recovery plan as a whole in your organization. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide, Steve. In discussing with Steve what we were going to talk about today, I mentioned an example of a customer that we had, and he thought it'd be excellent to share with you exactly what happened. About a year and a half ago, we had a customer that we were in conversations with. They were a large commercial manufacturer who, during the sales process, experienced some catastrophic equipment failure. They were literally days away from contracting with us for an all-encompassing disaster recovery solution, but we hadn't gotten it yet, and we hadn't set up for it yet. So we were unable to help them out. And in discussing with him, I know that the 6 hours they were down cost them more than the 3-year contract that we had for them, that we had put in front of them. Hundreds of thousands of dollars they lost. It was quite a hit for them. Quite honestly, they signed the contract 2 days later, so we we made sure that it wasn't going to happen again. And lo and behold, they had another equipment failure about 7 months later, after we had already signed them up, tested their recovery, and instead of losing hundreds of thousands of dollars and down for X number of hours, we had a number of their critical servers up in a matter of minutes. Most of their employees had no idea that they even had a disaster the second time, as opposed to a number of embarrassing stories, one of which I know had to do with SharePoint and a manager that was unable to give his presentation to an executive team because he couldn't access the documents, let alone the engineers and project managers that couldn't work on existing projects because of their inability to access SharePoint and the databases that were connected to it.
Yeah, Ryan,
So,
and I want to jump in there real quick because this was something you and I had talked about offline, and and I kind of alluded to it at the beginning. Is a lot of organizations again are using SharePoint now for line of business, what I'll call line of business applications. These are mission critical documents. Services organizations are using them for project sites that contain critical project documents, project budgets, schedules, task lists, etc. And when you're dealing in a large environment like that, every hour you're down where somebody can't bill if they're in a services environment or can't access that information, like you said, it can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars rather quickly. So just shows you the way SharePoint has kind of evolved when it first started to be kind of the center of a lot of organizations and how they run and manage their business and store information related to their business.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I will, on a side note, say that as I've come to learn more about SharePoint in preparing for this presentation, it blows me away how integral I found it to be in a number of our customers' environments. It is really quite incredible. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Assessing your current disaster recovery situation or your plan is the first step in approaching a solution. Where are you at today? A lot of people don't know. It's as simple as that. Others, and most common, are sporadic coverages. They have an extra server lying in one of their other offices. They have tapes being backed up and taken home with one of the managers. They've got a sister organization that has room in their data center for them to run if something were to go wrong. But the real question is, with all these theoretical solutions, does it work? I mean, have you tested it? And the answer is most oftentimes no. No, in theory it works. We think it'll go well, but we've never tested it. And that's when it comes down to using a contracted disaster recovery provider. Baselines, there are others out there. We're certainly not the only ones. We're certainly not the biggest ones. But what somebody of our caliber would do is help you feel comfortable in your disaster recovery plan and do exactly that. Test etc., etc. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll get a little bit further into what that means. In assessing, we need to evaluate. When you go to begin your disaster recovery planning, there are going to be a number of steps that hopefully a DR provider will walk you through, be it ourselves or anybody for that matter. And I've picked some of the critical points that you should be covering. One, where is your critical information residing? In this case, SharePoint. Where does all of your SharePoint database or files sit? Most oftentimes we get a quick response that in further investigation turns out to be not quite the whole story. A lot of times some will be in one place, some information will be in another, but it's critical in order to back up that information, we know where it is. Once you've confirmed what that information is, which files need to be backed up, which are the most important, and where it resides, you need to figure out how long you can survive without it in the event of a disaster. What is your RTO? Now, that's going to extend beyond your SharePoint server. As critical as that is, let's be honest, how many people out there could really get by without their Exchange server? I don't know of a single customer of ours now that back up critical servers that don't include their Exchange server. So there are going to be other critical applications that we need to back up, be it SQL, other files, etc., which we'll cover in a little bit. But begin to acknowledge the time as far as your recovery objective goes. The next would be the recovery point objective. Now, RPO, as it corresponds to the situation, refers to when is the last time you backed up your information. Oftentimes people do it once a night, sometimes once a week. Others find their data needs to be backed up every few minutes or every keystroke for that matter, in which case that's another conversation for another day. But the recovery point objective will tell us how long you can go in between backing data up. Next is outlining your budget. As much as we would all like to have an unlimited budget for disaster recovery, it's not realistic. So we need to figure out the sweet spot in where your tolerance for risk and your realistic budget cross. How long can you be down? How much is it going to cost you to be down? Those are things that you're going to need to speak with your CFO, your other heads of departments, and decide what is it really worth to you. And then after you've done all that, you can choose your appropriate solution. At that point, I like to use the sleep test. Once you've discussed your solution and you've decided on it, have you gone far enough so that you can go home and sleep soundly knowing that if there's a disaster, you're safe, you're up and running? Most of the time before we get a hold of somebody, it's well, if I was to think about it before I fall asleep, chances are good I'm not going to close my eyes that night. To sleep great. Options. As I mentioned previously, SharePoint is part of an overall environment within your data center, within your IT infrastructure. There's going to be a prioritization of critical servers within that environment. And within that prioritization, you need to figure out where they fit between the hot, warm, and cold, as I've set out here. As I mentioned, some organizations decide that it is worth the considerable amount of money to have redundant systems and immediate failover, so that when somebody's typing a document and they have a disaster, they can literally pick up where that last automatic save was and continue working on their document. Now, in most cases, it's not worth the exorbitant amount of cost for that solution. The most common is going to be the warm standby, which is the in-between, 24 hours or less. In that case, you'll be able to back up your documents on a nightly basis, for example. A product that we use automates that for you. We have a number of customers that never have to worry about tape anymore. Their information is automatically backed up, downloaded to an off-site location, in this case usually our data center, and in the event of a disaster, we can rebuild their information. They don't have to worry about getting tapes to us, etc., which really helps to fall into that 24 hours or less. Unless you're using a local disaster recovery provider, getting tapes and media to a DR provider and building those systems under 24 hours is not really realistic. But there are systems within your organization. Let's use payroll for an example. If you have a disaster, of course you need to get out payroll, but you don't oftentimes need it within 24 hours. Maybe you have time to build it up in 2 days since you're only doing it, let's say, bi-weekly. Or other accounting informations, maybe archived files. You regularly need to access a file from 7 years ago, then yeah, you may fit that into the warm standby. But most organizations don't need to access that 5-year-old file regularly, and that can stand to be set back a little bit into the cold standby zone, where you will save significant amounts of money in how you approach disaster recovery. Let's go ahead and switch to the next slide. Help or having a disaster. What happens when we get the call? Now, I'm sure my engineers would strangle me for making this into 3 bullet points and 20-some words, given us how much work goes into it. But I've tried to very simply address what happens when you have a disaster. In this case, since we're using SharePoint, the first step is going to be recovering the SharePoint data from your backup source, whether it is that online data protection that I spoke about a minute ago, whether you're replicating to another SAN device at a different location, virtual tape library, or you're backing up to tapes. No matter what, we need the data that's on that source. Once we've accessed that data, the next step is going to be repopulating the new system, getting that data to a point where you can use it. It's no good sitting on those backup sources. We need to actually put it and build it onto a server so that your employees, or customers for that matter, can have access to it. Lastly, establishing the remote access for your workforce. Once it's populated on these servers, they need to be able to dial in from their laptop. They need to be dialing in from their desk. Maybe you lose your primary location, so you have employees sitting at a hotel on their laptop. There can be, very simply, a communication set up so that they don't even know that they're not sitting at their desk. They can continue working and accessing, in this example, their SharePoint data as if they were at their desk in the office on a normal business day. For that matter, if you have employees traveling, from their smartphone, from their tablet, just as simply accessing their information as if anything else was going wrong. And everything else, as I touched on earlier, Exchange servers, SQL servers, custom applications, all of those will fall under the same general 3 points in the event of a disaster. And figuring out which of those happens first, be it SharePoint, Exchange, etc., will determine the cost and means for backup and recovery that will be in your solution. Let's go to the next slide. Try to create a fairly straightforward diagram to follow what an organization might look like with a disaster recovery plan in place. In this case, you can see at the bottom, your employees, be it on laptops, desktops, etc., are going through your firewall and accessing your SharePoint data. You can see that SharePoint connectivity goes to your in-house file systems, and that's where they're saving, they're bringing documents back up, they're doing all of their normal everyday work. If they were to use let's say an online data protection solution that backs it up once a night, at the end of the day, that in-house file server is going to replicate the changed data to a different backup server or SAN unit at an offsite location. So that in the event of a disaster, if we switch to the next slide, and you remove that in-house file server, nothing changes other than where that SharePoint system is looking to get its data. your customers are going to the same place. They're seeing, or your employees are going to the same place. They're seeing the same screens when they go to log in. Your SharePoint server is now rerouted to look at a different location, and it now has access to the same data that it did before. Now, as I mentioned, this is all very simplified, and even to apply the same diagram, there are multiple ways to skin the cat. So I'm not going to go, I guess, into too much further detail. If anybody has further questions on different ways for handling that, feel free to contact us after the webinar, and we'll get in more detail. But I'm going to try to keep this flying at at the 2,000-foot level. Next screen. Finally, and I think lastly in our presentation, is what to expect from a DR provider, whether it be Baseline or anybody else. There are different expectations that I think are realistic within the industry. In the 3 modes that you're going to be experiencing, one being your setup mode or your solution evaluations, basically putting together your DR plan, your normal day, everyday operations mode, and disaster mode when things go wrong. During the setup process, vet your disaster recovery provider. Make sure that they have the security and the audits that fit your organization's needs. Make sure that their engineers are experienced. We have seen some in the industry that have decided to put in very high-end hardware into a beautiful facility, but they don't really have the personnel to back it up. So make sure that whoever you're depending on has the knowledge behind them. And there are a number of great disaster recovery providers out there, so don't get me wrong. A detailed technical assessment, make sure that they look into your environment specifically. Make sure they don't just present to you, here's how we do it, pick options A, B, or C. And that falls into the next section, proposing multiple solutions. They should know your environment well when they make a recommendation for your disaster recovery solution. Every single one of you out there is unique. In the hundreds of customers that we have, I can assure you that there are no 2 with the same IT infrastructure. It's important that your DR provider knows that and knows how to approach it. In your normal operations mode, your day-to-day, your annual regularity, make sure that they're keeping in touch with you. It shouldn't be going 12 months in between hearing from them. And I say 12 months because that brings us to the next point, testing. We test all of our customers at least once a year, and as do most disaster recovery providers. That shouldn't be your only time of communicating with them. They should be proactively speaking with you, making sure everything's okay, making sure you haven't changed anything in your environment, making sure that they're prepared if anything were to go wrong, and make sure that they're doing their part to keep up with the industry per se. Technologies are always changing. You're never going to find a disaster recovery provider that always has the newest, the best technology on every platform across the board. It's impossible, but they should know that it's out there. We are constantly working to update our facility so that when you're ready to go to version 5.4, and we've been at version 5.3 with you, we've already tested it when you want to make your upgrade. We know what's coming up. So that in the event of a disaster, we are able to become an extension of your IT staff. We are able to work with your engineers. We don't want your engineers to have to drop everything at home, tell their kids and family, I understand that our office just got wiped out by a tornado, and yeah, it clipped our home too, but Dad's got to go to work because he's got to build up the computers. Let's be honest, that's not realistic. You want a DR provider that becomes an extension of your staff. They can help to build up your infrastructure when things go wrong, and in doing so meets the RPO, meets the RTO that you previously decided were critical points. And they get you connected to your organization. Make sure that you've tested so that in the disaster you are able to connect all of your employees. And this as a whole will allow your IT staff and every other employee for that matter to focus on regular operations. If everybody's scrambling to get get back from a disaster, you're not getting your daily responsibilities met. It's as simple as that. So the sooner you can be, the better off, and the more complete your solution will be. Let's go to the next slide. In summary, what's next for you? After you've assessed where you are right now, where your disaster recovery solution stands, determine what changes need to take place. What needs do you have? It's possible, and likely that a number of you already have great disaster recovery plans in place. Now I'm guessing that's not our target audience, as you've decided to log into today's call, but no doubt that there are a few of you that have a great plan in place already, and our hats off. We will never hesitate telling a customer that approaches us, you're doing a good job, you may want to check this or that, but overall, your plan works. For those of us, and I would say the majority of us that don't have the perfect plan out there, determine what needs to be changed, where you can improve, where you can, I guess, address points that may not have been previously addressed, and executing. Ask an expert for a solution, whether it be Baseline or another disaster recovery provider. There are people out there that can help you determine what that solution can be, help you figure out where your shortcomings are. And once you've figured that out, test it. And I think that's one of the most important lessons to be learned in disaster recovery. Testing is critical. Without a test, I can't tell you how many perfect disaster recovery plans have failed. You have to know that it's going to work, and test it extensively. Don't pick one little piece here or there and assume the rest is going to work the same, because I can assure you it won't. Although it may look like the same solution on the outside, different systems are going to react differently in a disaster. So with all of this, I think move forth and take a look back at what you've done so far. SharePoint, as I've come to learn in this presentation and preparing for it, is an awesome program, and it is critical in so many ways that I didn't even know was possible. So don't let it slip. Any questions?
Great, thanks, Ryan. No, I'm going to ask maybe the same question I asked to Sean when he was on back in March, and that is, where do you see in the organizations you work with, where do you see the most common missteps or mistakes, if you will, when it comes to disaster recovery? Even maybe going back to the example you used of that organization.
Well, the foremost mistake would be, it will never happen to me. Everybody's of the belief that it's not going to happen to us, but for those that have taken that realization, I would say sporadic testing. A lot of customers that we meet when we initially start talking tell us they already have a plan of some sort in place, but they haven't tested it. Whether it be SharePoint or another program, test your solutions. If you have a backup SharePoint server at another location, once a year at least, populate it, throw data over there, take a smattering of your employees and connect them to it, make sure they can access it, make sure that they can process information, access databases. Know that it works. Don't just trust that it does.
Right, and along those lines, I think, is the fact that what was a good disaster recovery plan a year ago, your environment changes, everything changes. If you're not testing and updating it, you're not going to realize that it's out of date if you don't test it. And when a disaster actually happens, you're like, this was a good plan, but all these things have changed. Now we're not accommodating it. We've started to move more and more things off of Exchange onto SharePoint. Exchange has got, we've got less downtime for Exchange than we do for SharePoint, but all those things have been moved now into SharePoint from an operational perspective. So, yeah,
absolutely.
I think testing is the big thing, and doing it and just making sure it's up to date. I know a lot of times it's hard to think about disasters because everything else you have going on in your daily schedule, standing up new systems, doing upgrades, doing everything else is kind of setting that time aside, quarterly, annually, whenever it is, to fully execute it and see where things need to be adjusted and adjusted accordingly.
That's a fantastic point, and one that Sean made well, and I should have emphasized better. it's a living and breathing document. Your disaster recovery plan is not going to stay the same. It's not stagnant. And as Steve just pointed out, as SharePoint takes a more integral role in your organization, as such, it should take a higher priority in your disaster recovery. What Exchange might have been doing for you a year ago may not be doing now, and there can be flops in prioritization. So make sure you're regularly assessing your disaster recovery plan. Year to year, it will not or should not be the same.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to leave it open for another couple of seconds. I think that'll do it. Ryan, I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon. This was very, very helpful. Did you have your contact information on here?
Yes. At I think the last slide, if you.
Let me go. Actually, go back to this one. So if anybody has any questions for either Ryan or myself, please feel free to email us. We can handle any questions regarding the webinar or anything else related to disaster recovery or any of the services that Baseline provides. Please email Ryan. Or if you have any questions about 30 on Thursdays, have an idea for a future topic, please feel free to email me, stevew@susqtech.com. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end today's session. Again, any questions, please email us. Ryan, thanks again for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.